Good evening, everyone. Thanks to everyone who's here in person. And thank you also to those who are following along online and will watch the recording afterwards. Thank you for coming to CIDOB. We are having a new edition of our cycle, What's Going On in the World, where we deal with different matters on the international agenda. And today, we will be able to tackle something that isn't really super current event, such as Brexit and its consequences, but which is still very relevant.
Política europea d'una manera constant i recurrent. I ho fem amb Simon Kuper. Thanks for being here. Simon és columnista del Financial Times, és conegut per haver obert les portes de l'estudi de l'esport com a fenomen polític, amb una especial atenció també aquí a Barcelona i amb el paper que el Futbol Club Barcelona ha jugat en molts esdeveniments també en clau política i social i que, per tant, per aquí l'haureu llegit anteriorment, però també és autor d'Amigocracia, Chums en anglès, que és una recopilació, un llibre que teniu a la vostra disposició aquí a fora per aquells que en vulgueu adquirir un exemplar, una recopilació de com la classe dirigent britànica en el seu moment, formada a les escoles d'elit abans de la universitat i després a Oxford, i el que significa aquesta classe política i el que la uneix, va acabar incidint plenament en el que és l'evolució del país, del Regne Unit, des del punt de vista de les elits, però també, sobretot, arran del referèndum del Brexit, el projecte de país en el seu conjunt. I el llibre, que us el recomano moltíssim, és una recopilació d'aquesta classe dirigent, de la seva vida i la seva formació, però també el seu impacte en la política. I només us vull llegir un parell de línies que crec que són exactament, mostren perfectament del que estarem parlant. Diu: y cuando aparecieron los problemas que los llevarían por delante, s'està referint a Tony Blair, a la guerra d'Iraq, però ara sobretot a Cameron amb el referèndum del Brexit, repeteixo, y cuando aparecieron los problemas que se los llevarían por delante, ninguno de los dos, Blair y Cameron, dio muchas vueltas a sus decisiones. Digo, después de todo, la vida les había enseñado que no les hacía falta. Las habilidades retóricas aprendidas en Oxford los sacarían de cualquier apuro y además seguro que la clase dominante les cubriría las espaldas. Una cita que básicamente viene a decir como el poder se articuló durante mucho tiempo en base a las habilidades narrativas.
With its great rhetoric, to talk about a process that perhaps might end up being absolutely disastrous for the country, but which was really well explained or had a convincing narrative, a narrative that was convincing enough behind it to make a significant part of the citizens end up voting in favor of that narrative, and how that clash, that struggle between different narratives and realities ended up becoming the history of Brexit as a great political project far removed from reality and its real impact, which is today a significant financial, political and social impact on the population as a whole and on the United Kingdom as a whole. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to CIDOB this evening. And it's a great pleasure to have with you Ramón González Férriz, who is a very well-known journalist, thinker in this country, who's also written at length about Brexit, and you can now follow him on El Confidencial, with his column on political and cultural affairs with an European and international scope, as well as Laura Pous, who is a journalist of the Catalan press agency, which will not just be conducting the discussion, but also as an ex-correspondent in London and well aware of the Brussels reality, because she was also a correspondent in Brussels. She'll be able to elucidate a little bit on the Brussels part of the Brexit. So I'll leave it in good hands. Thank you to the three of you for being here, and I'll be pleased to hear you. Good evening, everyone. We'll be speaking in Spanish, and that way Simon can follow us easier. Simon, first of all, what we have prepared for today's moderation is for Simon to offer an initial explanation of the book, which has been translated as Amigocracia. Our little cast of Oxford Tories took over the United Kingdom, so we can first get your introduction, and then Ramón can perhaps, since he also reviewed the book, can comment a little bit. And then if you'd like, we can start the discussion and discuss amongst ourselves a little bit, and finally leave some room for audience questions. So, Simon, take it away.
Hello, hola.
Thank you, Laura. Hello and welcome. I'll be now speaking in English, so apologies.
It's always a joy to come back here to Barcelona, a city where I have so many happy memories and have eaten so much good food. So thank you for inviting me. And the study of elites is something that I have practiced here as well, because when I wrote my book about Barça, in Spanish it's La complejidad del Barça, it appeared just a few months before Chums. And in some ways the books overlap. I'll just briefly discuss the Barça book. While I was writing it, I found that Barça, like Britain in modern times, is run by a small caste of men from the upper class here, who have known each other since student days often. And the Barça president always comes from this small group of Barcelona Catalan-speaking families of the bourgeoisie, which a caste many of you will know well. The caste that, as I understand it, typically belongs to the Real Club de Tenis Barcelona, goes on holiday in Sardinia, listens to music at the Liceo, and sits on the tribuna of the Camp Nou. And perhaps some of those people are even here tonight. And these are families that have tended to have known each other for generations. And when I asked people here to describe Barça or the city while I was working on the book, a word that often came up was endogamic. And in some ways, if you use political language, Barça, the club, is like a democratically elected oligarchy, where the president always comes from this oligarchy. And so it's not so different from the elite we're talking about tonight, Chums, the British conservative elites, largely of the Conservative Party, these Oxford-educated, conservative public school boys who led the push for Brexit and are today still the dominant political group in the UK. And I began thinking about this book, I realize now, the night of the Brexit referendum, that terrible night in June 2016. And as I was watching TV early in the morning, horrified, I saw these men of about my age, all men, traipse across the television screen. And I thought, I know these people. I know where they come from. These are people who went to university at Oxford the same time as me or just before me. All of them really, except Nigel Farage, the far-right populist leader, were Oxford men of my generation, more or less. And that's strange because Oxford is quite a small university, obviously, relative to the population. About 3,000 students a year arrive at Oxford as undergraduates. It's less than 0.5% of each British age cohort. But Britain is an oxocracy. It's ruled by Oxford. And of course, Oxford's not the whole story. The caste I'm talking about is also created by exclusive private schools, especially Eton. But Oxford is a really significant independent variable. And it's where the British political elite is created. And you can even tell the story of modern British politics without mentioning any other university. And Oxford is so important that if a few people like Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, and the theorists of Brexit, Dan Hannan, had been rejected by Oxford age 17, they wouldn't have gone to Oxford, would have had much more difficulty reaching political power later. And in that case, I think Brexit probably would not have happened. Now, oxocracy is not new. Britain has had 17 prime ministers since 1940, since Churchill. 13 of those 17 went to Oxford. Only one, Gordon Brown, went to any other university. And today we have had 5 consecutive Oxford Conservative prime ministers through Rishi Sunak. So how did Oxford capture the British political machine, and with what consequences? I argue in the book that there's 2 reasons why Oxford has this political dominance. One is the Oxford Union Debating Society, whose presidents include Boris Johnson, but also politicians like Theresa May, Harold Macmillan passed through it. And this is where the aspiring politicos learn rhetoric and convincing an audience. And the other reason is the politics, philosophy, economics degree, PPE, which exists at Oxford but not at Cambridge. And a lot of British politicians, like in today's government, Rishi Sunak, the new Foreign Secretary David Cameron, the Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt, they did PPE at Oxford. It attracts politicos who believe, well, if I study a bit of politics, bit of economics, bit of philosophy, I'm ready to govern a country. Now, every Oxford political cohort is different, is shaped by its era, and I want to contrast two different Oxford generations. And one is the generation of Oxford men who fought in World War I and then later became Prime Minister. So Harold Macmillan, Clement Attlee, Anthony Eden, and similarly later Ted Heath fights in World War II. He's a hero of the Battle of Normandy, 1944, and then becomes Prime Minister in 1970. So you have these Oxford men who have been through world wars, and that really shapes and creates them. Harold Macmillan said in old age, 60 years after World War I, he said that upper-class officers like himself who led working-class troops, and I quote Macmillan, "We learned for the first time how to feel at home with a whole class with whom we could not have come into contact in any other way." So for a junior officer from Oxford like Macmillan, these upper-class young men, he was responsible for the lives of the working-class soldiers under his command. And when they died, it was this junior officer who had to write letters to their mothers. So it was a very British, very paternalistic relationship, but it was also very responsible. The Oxford man was responsible for the working-class men. And so, from 1914 through 1945, these upper-class Oxford men had this experience, formative experience early in life of cross-class solidarity. In the trenches in World War I, the officers slept in beds and the men slept on the ground, but there was a sense of one nation. I don't want to get too sentimental about this. I don't want to get sentimental about the virtues of war, but they did feel, I think, the upper-class men, we are responsible for the working class, for their well-being, not just now, but they carried that feeling on after the war. So when these war veterans become prime ministers from, say, 1940, so Churchill had fought in World War I as a volunteer. After leaving the cabinet, after being kicked out of the cabinet, Churchill, who was then about 40 years old, went to the front in World War I and almost was killed in Belgium twice. So from 1940 until 1979, almost all the time, Britain is led by war veterans. And these war veterans build a British social democracy. This is our era of social democracy, of quite high equality. And it ends in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister. Of course, she's not a war veteran, and she dismantles social democracy. And then very different is today's generation of Oxford men who have run the country, and two Oxford women, Liz Truss and Theresa May, who have run the country since 2010. And these people are the luckiest, most privileged members of a generation that has lived in untroubled times. It's a generation without tragedy. They are the privileged members of a country that for 300 years has avoided revolution, dictatorship, famine, civil war, invasion, or economic collapse. So they were lucky enough not to live in interesting times, but they felt a strange kind of envy for their ancestors who had ruled Britain in a more exciting period. If you were born into the ruling class in the 1960s, like Johnson or Cameron, you look back on your fathers and grandfathers who'd run the country through 2 world wars, through empire, and you thought, that was a glorious time, that was a glorious era. And now we're in this era of British decline, where this mid-sized, struggling outpost of the European Union, we don't really matter very much, and you live in this tame, vegetarian, low-stakes, Brussels-based, post-imperial country that has nothing more glorious to offer you than the Falklands War. And so some conservatives of the Johnson generation, they wanted tragedy, they wanted to live in heroic times, and they went looking for a heroic project, which in the end becomes Brexit. Let's go back to Oxford in the 80s. I arrived there in 1988. David Cameron had left that summer. The year before, 1987, Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer had left. Keir Starmer, now the Labour leader, the probable next Prime Minister, had done his undergraduate degree at Leeds and then come to Oxford for 2 years to do a law graduate degree. I joined the university newspaper where we were always making fun of these absurd student politicians. We didn't realize that they were the future. So how did Oxford shape today's ruling class? Well, Oxford worsens an ancient tendency in British political culture, which is the overemphasis on rhetoric, on speaking and writing well. Boris Johnson, key example. Because the Oxford education system revolves around writing essays. You write one essay, maybe 2 essays a week, and then you present your essay to your tutor in a tutorial, and you discuss it with your tutor. Now, of course, you know very little about the subject. You're 19 years old. You wrote your essay in a hurry. You probably finished it at 5 in the morning. Your tutor is an expert. So you have to talk and sound more expert than you actually are. So in part, it's an education about bluffing your way, about speaking without much knowledge. And these essays were not expected to feature footnotes or original research. You just had to read a bit of a few books, or if you're very busy, a bit of one book, and then ideally present a bold, counterintuitive argument showing that the conventional wisdom about the subject was all wrong, which is a kind of ridiculous thing to do when you're 19 years old and you know very little. But it worked for me because the essay style I learned at Oxford turned out to be perfect preparation for becoming a newspaper columnist. And when I read The Economist, which I saw on your desk, I see that I'm not the only one who transferred those skills into punditry. And so then if you're a conservative politico, you go into the Oxford Union, which is mostly for politicians of the right, and that worsens this emphasis on rhetoric. The union doesn't make policy, it's not changing people's lives, it's just staging debates. And so it encourages this focus on rhetoric, this articulacy that enables Oxford-trained politicians, lawyers, and journalists to argue any case, whether they believed it or not. And in the union, you won debates not by boring the audience with detail and facts, so that was not considered impressive. You won it with ad hominem jokes and rhetorical tricks. The same went for winning union elections. The Oxford Union held elections 3 times a year, so it was always having elections for new president, new officers, and that was great training for people like Boris Johnson and Theresa May. The other important thing happening in Oxford in the 80s was the birth of a Eurosceptic movement. And this really starts 3 weeks before I arrived at Oxford, September 1988. Margaret Thatcher gives her famous Bruges speech. She's Prime Minister. Until then, she'd always been a good European. She'd been building the single market with Jacques Delors, the European Commissioner. But suddenly she turns Eurosceptic. She realizes Europe is going to become more federalist. And in the Bruges speech, she warns against a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels. So her speech and her new Euroscepticism, it spooks the Oxford conservatives of my generation. They think, we're going to rule Britain when we grow up. We don't want people in Brussels trying to rule Britain for us. So they're quite emotional about this, and they take a Eurosceptic turn. In late 1990, a 19-year-old student called Dan Hanan creates with a couple of friends an anti-federalist movement called the Oxford Campaign for an Independent Britain. Very pompous title, the CIB. But if you look back now, 33 years later, I see the CIB as the genesis of the idea of Brexit. The CIB quickly becomes the second biggest political institution in Oxford after the Oxford Union. When Hanan graduates in 1993, he goes down to London and he helps create the European Research Group, which becomes the basis of the Eurosceptic movement in the Conservative Party. Hanan becomes his first employee. So Dan Hanan in 1990 is like Karl Marx in 1848. He's the visionary, the theorist who sketches the paradise to come. Now, the rest of this generation, they're not really thinking about leaving the European Union, but they don't have a project. Because when Cameron and Johnson and the others arrive in London in the Commons in the early 2000s, they're looking for a project. Their problem is that Margaret Thatcher, their hero, had completed her political project. It's very rare for a politician to do almost everything that she wanted to do, but Thatcher had. Her project of privatization and tax cutting had been taken so far that if you went any further, then the UK would become a kind of Reaganite United States, or like Brazil. It would no longer be a recognizably European country. So you can't take Thatcherism any further. So they didn't have a grand project to match running world wars or empire or Thatcherism. They spend decades looking around for their project, and then some of them decide their project is going to be Brexit. That's their generational project. And it's the kind of grand cause that Oxford men like Johnson and Michael Gove had lacked all their political careers. It's a chance to live in interesting times, to make British politics a bit less boring, and to reclaim parliamentary sovereignty from the Brussels intruders. And they understood that Brexit might not work out, but you know, Britain, we're not Poland, we're not next to Russia. We're an island, we have no natural predators, we can afford a blunder, we can afford a misstep. Nothing really bad is going to happen to the country, and nothing really bad is going to happen to this upper class which has existed for centuries. And even more personally, the leading Brexiteers, Michael Gove and Johnson, were not having the political careers they thought they deserved in early 2016. So for them, the Brexit referendum is like an Oxford Union presidential campaign for grown-ups. It's a chance to get rid of David Cameron, and maybe one of them can replace him, which is what happens. Now, Brexit is often called an anti-elitist revolt, but that's only partly right. In fact, it's an anti-elitist revolt led by an elite. It's a coup by one set of public schoolboys against another, and it's backed by the Oxford public schoolboy media magnate Rupert Murdoch. And in fact, the elite credentials of people like Johnson and Gove helps persuade many voters to go with Brexit, because Johnson's curriculum vitae, his Oxfordness, his accent, his confidence, his use of Latin and Greek suggests to many voters, well, he's not just a funny man, he also is serious, he knows what he's talking about because he went to Oxford, so we can trust him with the national future. That impresses the 99% of voters who did not go to Oxford or Cambridge. Now, he fights the referendum with humor, which is a key part of British conversation, as you know. In England especially, humor is used to cut off conversations before they can become boring, emotional, or technical. So you may remember Johnson's famous joke about leaving the EU while keeping the benefits of the single market. He said, "My policy on cake is pro-having it and pro-eating it." Not so funny now. So he becomes Prime Minister in 2019, and almost immediately, he is hit by a problem for which Oxford had not prepared him, a virus. Here is a man whose degree was in Latin and Greek, whose cabinets have mostly done art subjects or PPE at Oxford, and suddenly they have to face questions of biology, statistics, exponential growth, about which they know nothing. Because Oxford specializes in producing politicians, administrators, lawyers, and commenters, people like me, who stopped doing maths and science age 16 and know very little economics. So a virus is not their speciality. When Johnson starts paying attention to the virus quite late, his instinct is to avoid lockdown, because one of the beliefs of the ruling caste is nobody makes rules for us. Men from the British ruling caste expect maximum individual freedoms. They don't like the idea of lockdowns. So the World Health Organization declares a pandemic on March 11th, 2020. Johnson kept the UK open until March 23rd. Many thousands of unnecessary deaths. The UK is now going through a very painful official COVID inquiry as to why it was such a disaster, why the country had one of the worst COVID death tolls in Europe. And at the time when ordinary Britons are locked up at home, people cannot go to their parents' funerals, we now know that in Downing Street they were having parties, drinks parties all the time. And it might seem crazy for Johnson to sacrifice his premiership for a few office parties, but then you have to remember, as a man from Eton and Oxford, he expected maximum personal freedom. The rules were not for him. Now, he's succeeded by two people, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, who represent a slightly different, more modern Oxford. They both come from the professional class. Truss is the daughter of a professor. Sunak is the son of a doctor. And so they represent the mainstream of Oxford in their student days in the 1990s. They come from comfortable professional backgrounds. It's a university that is increasingly female and non-white. And you still have a few hereditary posh people like Cameron, but it's a much more diverse university already. But although Truss and Sunak look modern compared to Cameron and Johnson, they both still represent the Oxocracy. Both get their elite membership cards for the elite, aged 18, based largely on the homes in which they grew up. And for both of them, Oxford is the fastest route to political power. I'll finish by saying that to my great surprise, Oxford and Cambridge are now reforming themselves. Oxford today is a much more professional, serious, and selective university than the one I went to. A man I know who's a history tutor there says someone like Boris Johnson would never be admitted now. That kind of articulate bluffer would not get in now. Lazy people have a much harder time. Students work harder than in the 1980s. And just in the last 5 years, Oxford and Cambridge have seriously reformed their admissions. There have been a whole wave of anti-elite movements in the UK, but elsewhere as well, that have embarrassed these universities into opening up to a more diverse group. So in Britain, Brexit has this anti-elite side. You have Me Too, which is about destroying the inherited privilege of men. You have Black Lives Matter, very important in the UK. And British state schools have got a lot better. So now Oxford and Cambridge, when they look at who to admit, they use contextual admissions. So they take account of the disadvantage that you might have overcome to reach your academic level. Did you go to a school that never sends people to Oxford? Were your parents poor? Are you caring for somebody in your family? Did you have free school meals? These kinds of things. And so Oxford and Cambridge have transformed their admissions. In 2000, about half of Oxford British students still came from private schools. Now that figure is about 32%, which is the lowest in history. But even now, much at Oxford remains as it was in the 1980s. The outsized role of rhetoric in the education system survives, and you'll have seen the return of David Cameron's British politics last week as Foreign Secretary. Now here is a man who really did terrible damage to Britain through the austerity policies that destroyed a lot of the welfare state, and then by lazily calling this referendum, which he lazily imagined he would win, and which will keep doing damage to Britain for decades. Now, anyone from an ordinary background who reaches the top of a profession and then fails spectacularly will never get a second chance. You will not be called back. But David Cameron went to Eton and Oxford, and people from his class often do get second chances. So he is back. So the Chums, the Amigocracia of my book, has done its damage. My generation of Oxford politicians has left the UK a poorer, more isolated, unhappier country than they found it. Britain needs many changes now, but one thing it needs is drastic elite reform. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. Now, Ramón, el teu comentari.
Well, first of all, I would really recommend reading Simon's book. This is a book that I think has two main virtues. Very frequently, we have a character of politics who carried out Brexit. Johnson was a clown. Brexit was a harebrained idea, at least the way we saw it from here. But what Simon does in the book is something that brought me to think about another Oxford character, who was Isaiah Berlin, who talked about the history of ideas. And what he does is to reconstruct the ideas beyond how parody-like these characters might seem. What Simon does is to reconstruct the genuine, honest, sincere ideas as these people believed them that would guide their career. And the second thing that I'm actually a little sore at Simon is because he destroys everything that enchanted us about the US. The things that some of us loved the UK about, the use of irony and extraordinarily cunning parliamentarianism, fantastic rhetoric, a high class as portrayed in the novels of Evelyn Waugh or Wodehouse. What Simon makes obviously clear is that this was very nice, but it damned its generation. The sort of self-parody of British virtue has damned a whole generation. A generation that, because of the job of the three of us sitting here, also comes to show something, which is the terrible perils that happen when journalists and politicians are too close to each other. In large part, the characters of this book, as Simon says, didn't know deeply about anything rather than talking and speaking, writing and speaking well, which is what journalists do. And in the worst case, what happens to journalists And many of these characters go from journalism to politics as if they were the same thing, as if it was just a matter of convincing, seducing, charming, amusing. And they do so in a way that seems very convincing, but that has ruined the country, and which has a lot to do with Berlusconi as well. Like everything that happens to us has to do with the deep domination of television, the power of Boris Johnson reciting the Iliad in Greek, or Nigel Farage, who has now finished in Survivors, the reality show. So there's an intrinsic relation between journalism and politics, which are constantly intermixed and poisoning each other. A generation that, as Simon was saying, has some ideas about themselves, about their own careers between journalism and politics, and which is also dangerous in politics when elites sense that their country is in decline and they must do something to pull it out of its decadence. We as an elite must do something to get our country out of decadence. And that's something that has deeply said, in large part, Western European politics for the last 15 years. Because Simon's book, even though it covers a very specific politics, the British, and more specifically Westminster, Oxford, and the press, I think it is within a context of Western politics that started after the 2008 crisis, and which in many ways has arrived to our days. In 2009, the Tea Party comes up. In 2011, we have the Occupy Wall Street and 15 March. Then in 2012, the Catalan independentist movement. In 2016, Cameron announces the referendum. In 2013, in 2015, Syriza comes into power in Greece, and it almost contributes to the euro breakdown in other countries. In 2016, Trump and Brexit. 2018, the Liga and the Five-Star Movement arrive in Italy. And this is a historical context that makes Simon's book genuinely British, but inscribe itself into the zeitgeist. As Simon was saying, there's something happening that I believe is important. All these movements that I mentioned, in large part from the Tea Party to Meloni in Italy, these are all movements that have wanted to be read as a shock between the elites and the people. The people, tired of corrupt elites, tired of neoliberal elites, tired of cosmopolitan elites, rises up to demand a more democratic and fairer system from the right, like the Tea Party or Alternative für Deutschland or Vox, or from the left, 15 March, Podemos, Syriza. But within this framework, and I think Simon's book is the one to reflect this best from all the ones I've read, is that this political dispute has actually all been between elites. Trump said he spoke for the American people, but he was part of the traditional American elites. Vox said they wanted to end up or deeply renew the Spanish Constitution, but they came from traditional elites. Podemos also came from traditional elites in Madrid, as well as the Catalan independentist movement was spearheaded by traditional elites in Catalonia. And in the case of Brexit, the most interesting thing about it is that Simon was talking in Greek in these refined, sophisticated environments, but they succeeded in convincing voters that they were anti-elite. They're the ones who will do away with corrupt elites of European politicians, of cosmopolitan politicians, the corrupt press. They will be the ones. And they're wearing smoking jackets and their parents live in a castle. So this has been a significant phenomenon across Europe and globally. But I think what Simon says is the utmost reincarnation of it. Thank you, Ramon. So starting off the discussion, Simon, what I wanted to ask you, and actually as Ramon was speaking, I remembered that Boris Johnson was a correspondent in Brussels, if I'm not mistaken, for the Telegraph, and that during Brexit, his time as a journalist there were sorely remembered because of this political journalist link that is sometimes a bit dangerous. In any case, in the book, and you actually quoted it in your introduction, you mention old colleague of yours who's now a tutor at Oxford who said, today, someone like Boris Johnson would never be admitted in Oxford. Does that mean, do you think, that today Oxford is ashamed, is embarrassed of having created Boris and friends?
A lot of shame. I mean, I noticed this when I went back to Johnson's old college. Oxford consists of about 30 or 35 colleges. Together they form the university. And in Johnson's college, in the dining room, there is no portrait of Johnson, although when I went, he was Prime Minister. And they'd taken down all their old Prime Ministers, Balliol College had taken down because they didn't want to, they wanted to pretend it wasn't just about Johnson. And instead, the whole dining room was hung with portraits of women who were associated with the college. And that's a very kind of Oxford 2022 statement about the kind of university it wants to be and the kind of university it doesn't want to be anymore. And, you know, I've given 4 talks in Oxford since the book was published, so I've been back a lot. And I think there is some soul searching at the university. How did we produce these people who learned here how to speak and how to convince people of something that wasn't true? And how do we reform so as not to do that again? And also, how do we not let in people who are lazy, who, based on their privilege, get into Oxford and join the ruling class? How do we stop being that conveyor belt of posh young men into the ruling class?
Porque de hecho, uno de los...
Right, because actually one of the things that you mentioned in the book, you were saying they could party and just present their essays to the teacher with a hangover, just bluffing their way through it. And these are qualities which they later apply to politics. I know there's speeches in Westminster, the speeches that that Ramón was saying, we admire them. Because when we look to British politics with a certain admiration of how fun it is to watch a debate in Westminster, but maybe that's just a pantomime, that's just a bluff, as you say, in Oxford. And I wonder whether these stories in Oxford, which we later saw, that they really had no plan to execute Brexit once they got it done. We want this candy, what do we do with it now that we have it? I wonder if they applied what they had learned to improvise their way through this. Yes, we will improvise to see how we will execute this Brexit. Are they still improvising today?
There was no plan. I mean, when Brexit happened, I opposed Brexit, but I thought they must have a plan. They've had studies done, they've worked out the next steps. When we leave, we will do X, Y, and Z. And then we have a plan for the whole future of Britain post-Brexit. There was nothing. There wasn't even a page of A4. And that's very Oxford, very Boris Johnson. And so that means that the last 7 years they've been constantly working out, what do we do now?
Pero yo, de nuevo, creo.
But again, I think this is a trait that many of these movements, populist we might call them, or insurgent. I tend to call them insurgent because I think populism has been used to death between all of us. That Donald Trump scene is famous, where they tell him, okay, now you're president. You need to hire 3,000 people. And Donald Trump doesn't even know where to start or hire them from. Who do we need to hire? I don't know how to staff the White House. And I think this happened in large part with the five-star movement in Italy. Over a very short period of time, it went from being literally a comedian, a professional comedian who does satire, satirical plays, to being a prime minister who must do very sophisticated things. And I think this has happened very frequently in Spanish politics, in Catalan politics, and across all of Spain. So obviously this is a trait from Brexiteers, but this is also something that's very typical of our time. People who are insurgent, they don't know if they'll get to power, but when they do, Podemos was the smallest case, but when Podemos reached the Spanish parliament, they didn't even know where to leave their coats.
Milei, who also is a television performer, and like Johnson, a very convincing television performer, and we will abolish 5 ministries, etc. And I'm sure there is no plan.
No, okay.
Well, todos estos, pero no.
Well, yeah, but none of these people went to Oxford, so the responsibility of Oxford over all these movements
a certain different style. So the style of Oxford is more ironic and humorous than Trump. So the style of Johnson is different from the style of Trump or Millet or Gris or all these people.
Pero todos con el mismo patrón, ¿no?
They're cousins.
But they're all cut from the same cloth.
Y hablábamos de Boris Johnson porque creo que es quizá uno de los personajes, ¿no?, que más ha fascinado. Antes Ramón hablaba de que aquí se veía como un poco un payaso, ¿no? Mucha gente tendrá en la memoria esa imagen de él colgando de una tilorina, ¿no?, en Londres. Pero bueno, que ha tenido una responsabilidad muy importante en el país y que acabó dimitiendo después de un montón de escándalos, de salvarse de una tras otra, pero al final acabó cayendo, acabó también dimitiendo como diputado por engañar al Parlamento por el tema de la pandemia. En general, ¿tú cómo valoras a él, al personaje de Boris Johnson, no ya solo en el contexto de Oxford, sino...
Boris Johnson as a character. Because I wonder, he's perhaps the archetype of this character that you describe here in Chums.
Example for my book, and while I was writing the book, I was very worried that he would go before the book appeared. And I was the only person in Britain in the end, or the only British person. I was living in Madrid actually when it appeared. I was the only British person in the world who was hoping that Boris Johnson would survive, because I needed him to promote my book, because he is the extreme and perfect example of what I'm talking about. He's an exaggerated example of what I was saying. It's almost unfair for me to use Johnson, because his laziness, his amateurism, his use of rhetoric without any content is just, it's Oxford squared, you know.
Pero diría Ramón que...
But Ramon, would you say there are these democratic bases in Boris Johnson that we don't see as such, for instance, in Trump or in Millet? So perhaps Johnson has a respect.
Primero, yo me acuerdo...
Okay, first thing first, I remember, and I wonder, Laura, if you maybe remember reading the British press when you were a correspondent in the UK. For a journalist, the British press, serious and less serious, has always been deeply fascinating to us. And my other fascination was by a magazine called The Spectator that Boris Johnson directed for a while. And it was an amazing magazine and absolutely demented.
No, I know.
It was, I'm very sort of not very original ideologically speaking, but it was a wildly right-wing magazine, very well done.
Y algunos más, en realidad, ¿no?
And a few others, actually. There was a weird combination. There were center-liberal people, but some things were really far out. I remember laughing at anti-Semitic jokes and saying, whoa, they can't do this. I remember the Brexit campaign. There were completely absurd arguments in financial terms, in economical terms, but extremely efficient. Yes, it's a magazine that's very important to the conservative right. That's a bit posh, a bit snobby, but very addictive. And perhaps I'm exaggerated, but I see Boris Johnson nearly as what that magazine represents. Someone really cultivated, well-educated, who can use culture as a status symbol, as a symbol of belonging to the high class, and with the cosmic frivolity, the degree of frivolity that they have, I think it's hard to understand. Here we have terrible politicians, I mean, to each their preferences, but the amount of frivolity of, we can do anything, no problem, this might be anti-constitutional, no worries, we'll get it done. This is astonishing. And when he decided to shut down Parliament, I guess it also affects that this is a country without a written constitution. But you're right. He's no fanatic. He's not a fanatic. And it's not a fanatic style like Trump. It's an ironic, frivolous style. Yeah, but the minute he goes, yeah, we can get this done. No worries. And they said, well, we're going to have a commerce treatise to sell tomatoes and lettuce. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, we'll do it. I wonder if you were amazed by that, as I was. Because I know because it's that feeling of, in the UK, as you're saying, there's no constitution, we can do everything, we'll do it, nothing's been thought about, but we'll get it done. And I wonder, Simon, whether that comes from that sort of Oxford training of, yeah, we'll bluff our way through it, we can do anything, we'll just come up with a plan. What I remember is, and I think this has happened to a lot of people who've worked in the UK or have lived in London, where you go back a fan of the country. I love London. I love the UK. I love Scotland. I love everything. And then during the time I lived there, I thought, well, I might be able to predict a little bit how things might go without being an expert in British politics. But I think I sort of know where the shoe's gonna fall. But suddenly 2016 comes, Brexit comes, and this new generation, this new British way of doing politics. I am completely lost. I don't even know what they're gonna do. Not because they voted Brexit, because that, I think, factored into a lot of people's calculation, but how they applied things later. They looked rather lost. It was constant improvisation. This change, this drift in the political class, Simon, I wanted to ask you, do you think that Tories are going from a more traditional right towards a populist right with some racist undertones? The last, Home Secretary, what's happening to the right where they represent that British establishment? You know they're right-wing, but you know what they're going to do.
It wasn't just that politics was a game, politics was a joke, was a kind of long joke, which is very strange. And this invulnerability, what you say, this frivolousness, we can do what we want. Britain is very unusual in that it is this country without traumas. I mean, I know foreigners hate it, Spaniards hate it when we foreigners talk about the Civil War, but you guys have a trauma of the Civil War and Franquismo, which is unresolved in the country. I live in France. World War II is a sense of guilt, unhappiness, Algeria as well. I grew up in the Netherlands. The occupation is a source of guilt and vulnerability. And of course, these experiences you find all across the continent. Britain has no guilt, it has no vulnerability, it has no traumas. And so then, if you're on the right especially, you can treat politics as a game. Just very briefly on the, yes, the Conservatives now face the option of moving far right. Do you become Trump? And I think that when they lose the election next year, they will become Trump and somebody like Braverman will take over. I think that is probable.
But at the same time, tenéis un primer ministro.
But at the same time, you have a prime minister of Indian origin. You've had a black chancellor. You've had a home minister, who I believe was also Braverman. So in a way, and I agree that clearly there's racism and anti-immigration campaigns, the Tory establishment has accepted the new cultural and racial reality in Britain.
British racial mixing, that when Rishi Sunak becomes the first non-white prime minister, nobody cares. It just wasn't a subject. It was barely discussed. And I love that about Britain.
Es que creo que no es un.
Because I don't think it's a racism against Britons from that, with different origins. It's a racism against people from outside, whoever they are, people who don't hold a British passport.
Que es pobre, ¿no?
And poor. Obviously not the sheiks who have millions in oil.
Against the newest arrivals. If, like Braverman or Sunak or James Cleverly, you're already here, you're British.
Exactly.
Not 100% for everyone, but most people are fine with that. It's the people who want to arrive tomorrow. And then there's also the issue of Islam, which, as we saw in the Netherlands last night, is still a very kind of provocative issue for the racist right, which I think is also part of Braverman's own baggage.
Un tema que te quería preguntar que no lo tenía apuntado.
There's something I didn't write in my script, but I wanted to ask about. I thought it might be interesting. In Chums, you talk about men above all, men from Oxford, but you mentioned 2 female prime ministers and who had, didn't have it so well as prime ministers, especially Liz Truss, who...
Pero no sé si hay un...
But I wonder whether there's a difference between students, male Oxford and female Oxford students in that time. I'm not talking about today. And especially because in the book, you also talk about the amount of sexism and machismo present in those meetings and those parties. The experience at Oxford, Theresa May and Liz Truss must be very different to Boris Johnson.
And the Oxford of upper-class men like Boris Johnson and David Cameron is a small part of Oxford. In my day, it was maybe less than 10% of the students. These people are not representative, and middle-class people like me, never really met them. We never met people like that because they had their own friends. And if you were a woman, you had a very different experience of Oxford. Those groups were interested in you, but not really to make you an equal member of their society. But they were always on the lookout for women. And so there are many different experiences of Oxford. My sister went to Oxford a few years after me, and she said it was not a good place to be a woman. So absolutely, Liz Truss and Theresa May were in political Oxford. They didn't rise to the top. I think Truss because she was such a weirdo that she always took a very aggressive, extreme position, even as a student politician. She always liked to alienate people. So she was always bad at politics, but supremely self-confident. Theresa May was a more conventional figure in the Union, did not rise to be president. So women are not full members of this caste that I describe. And in the Labour politicians also usually come through Oxford, like Starmer and his number 2, Rachel Reeves. And Labour has never been led by a woman. Labour has never really had a woman in a very high position. So Labour, in fact, has more of a problem with exclusion of women than the Conservatives. But both these groups come from Oxford.
Si queréis
Another of the subject matters I wanted to bring up is this political chaos that we've seen from Brexit. 5 prime ministers. Sunak is the 5th in the list in 6 years. Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss and Sunak. Between the death of the Queen, for a few months, it was really chaotic. And Ramón, please add whatever you will. Has there ever been such a chaotic period in British history?
The Economist said that Britain had become Italy, but this caused great offence in Italy, where they said we're not as bad as that. No, it's completely new. So all the rules of British politics have been demolished, and the Conservatives are eating each other because they supported Brexit, but they didn't know what Brexit was. And so Brexit is like communism. It always disappoints. You know that Brexit is a great idea. You know that communism is a great idea. But the Brexit we have today, the communism we have today, is not the right one. We must keep looking for a new one. So they keep getting rid of their leaders.
¿Y cómo interpretáis, Ramón?
And how do you interpret this return of David Cameron? Simon was saying earlier that this kind of elites are forgiven for everything. You can come back. If it were any other person, wouldn't have been able to return with their head held high as foreign secretary. In more general terms, going back to the first thing I said, I think it proves that we are incapable of quitting the last decade. Everything that happened the past decade is after us. Trump will be elected again. Puigdemont is coming back. Cameron's come back. We're not giving any closure to the previous decade. We haven't been able to solve it. And then I believe that there's a part of British Conservatives in particular, but also centre-right parties in Spain, in France, whatever's left of them, Germany, Italy, whatever's left of them, that are really looking for an ideology. The traditional centre-right, the Europeans often within the popular economy, many people looked up to the British Tories as the traditional centre-right, liberal, free market. And if that's not dead, it's definitely dying. And I believe that the Britons are looking for an ideology. And I'm afraid that the one they're going to find, as the American Republican Party has done, or as many of former French Republican voters or Forza Italia, the ideology that they're falling on is far right. But beyond us opposing a radical right, I think they're genuinely looking for an ideology. They're trying to do Thatcherism in a way where that's no longer possible. How can we have the capacity to create myths from a semi-imperial United Kingdom when that's no longer likely? I think that's a search beyond how much we might dislike them. This is a genuine search for a viable ideology.
Are certain about is nativism. Anti-immigration, that's a fairly fixed point in all these movements.
Sí, creo que la inmigración hemos...
true. We haven't spoken much about immigration, but ultimately immigration in many ways was the central point for Brexit. A part of the argument that the leaving, was the supposition that Turkey would enter the UK and therefore UK would be filled with Turks. The current debate on the boats crossing the channel, I think, is incomprehensible for those of us who are outside. And just to finish the discussion and open up the floor, so please start preparing your questions. Simon, how will the new generation of British politicians be? Because in the book, you mention how Oxford now is not the way it was. You can't just, show up before your tutor and improvise with a hangover. They've really gone more serious about this. And I wonder if this will generate a new onslaught of leaders challenging a little bit those who came before them. Or if, as Ramon was saying, we're looking for a new ideology and they veer towards that racist populist right, whether we'll keep having this kind of characters. Is there any hope for a new British elite, or you're not very optimistic?
And the economy has stagnated for many years, and it's hard to run a country without money, which is what Labour is going to be doing from next year. So I'm not very optimistic that the UK is going to transform into a successful country. But I think it will become it's already becoming a more grown-up country. It's lost the kind of fantasy of going it alone Brexit. And in surveys, people say they want more technocratic politicians. So I think there's a return of seriousness. And what Brexit created is a strong pro-European movement of a kind that you find now only in Britain and Ukraine. A large popular pro-European movement, which is now largely behind Labour, which is not so excited about Europe, but that movement will find its outlet in politics. So more serious, more pro-European, but it's going to be a sober Britain without money, without much prospect. And there will be a small group of politicians who try to create a British far right, try and turn the Tory Conservative Party into a British far right. I don't think they will succeed, but my predictions are always wrong.
Well, hopefully not. Molt bé, doncs, si volen...
All right, if you have any questions, I think we have a mic going round.
Aquí.
Hola. Gracias. Ha sido...
Hello, thank you. This was a really good presentation. You understand Spanish. I belong to a generation that came before yours, but I was also a correspondent, first in London and then in Brussels. And in Brussels, I actually met Boris Johnson. And I have an anecdote to add, because he really let us intuit what he would be. When he came into the press room on the daily briefings from the European Commission, we knew we'd have fun that day. When he even asked his question in Latin. So I don't think comparing him to Trump, I think Johnson is more cultured than Trump. But it's also true, he was the hammer of the speakers of the European Commission because he was very well informed. And so he asked really difficult questions about petty details, things that were maybe made up about the measurements of bananas. But this was a daily occurrence. And those who knew him back then, and I think we have other colleagues that also were there with him at the same time, I was horrified. I couldn't see how he could make that leap into politics. Not when he got to Prime Minister, I mean when he made it to London Mayor. I think we were all astonished. But I want to ask you a question specifically. He's created a strong pro-European movement, you said, and I believe there are some indicators that whether the referendum were to happen now, leave wouldn't be approved. I think that's what the polls are saying. I wonder if someday we can expect another referendum. But I wanted to ask you whether that Oxford elite that is fostering this or that, since you say that now Oxford is a little embarrassed and there's a soul searching, whether among these elites
what they did, what has happened, and what in reality. Y ya solo para...
And Just to finish really quickly, this is just an anecdote, and I know this is not the matter for today, but I wanted to correct Ramon on something. Ramon, I think you put a lot of things in the same bag now talking about populism. And I would admit that the Catalan independentist movement has some elements of populism, but I think reducing it to that is oversimplification. I think it's far too complex. That's all I wanted to point out. Thank you. That's just my opinion. Thank you.
Has written a book which will come out in January. It's very hard in 5 minutes to present everything with all the subtlety that one can do in a book, so read the book. I think they have regrets, these people. I think inside themselves they know that the biggest thing they did in their careers was a failure. And it's been 7 years. Nobody is able to point to a concrete advantage of Brexit. There was no trade deal with the US, there was no trade deal with China, immigration did not stop, the European Union gave us a terrible deal, the border in Ireland is a problem. It's very hard to find something positive. And when you ask them, they can't do it. And I think inside themselves, these people have this horrible feeling, I screwed up, we made a terrible mistake. But of course, they can never admit it, because how can you, if you're 55 years old, this is the main act of your career, your political career is probably going to end next year with the elections when Labour probably win. How can you say, guys, I'm sorry, it was a mistake?
En esto tiene que ver también
And this is also historic coincidences have a lot to do with it, because we were talking about Oxford, about generation of Tories, but perhaps simply if Labour had had a decent leader, things could have been different, the referendum.
I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was a secret left-wing Brexiteer, what we now call a Lexiteer, and he thought that the EU is this capitalist plot, and so it was better to leave, and so he refused to come on television and speak against Brexit, which is the job of a Labour leader.
Yo, pero, añadiría una cosa que a mí también me...
But I would add something that gave me pause for reflection, which is when I covered the whole Brexit campaign, especially from Brussels, to it I also attribute a certain responsibility to the EU in not being able to seduce the British enough. Because in a way, Cameron, after going to Brussels and trying to negotiate, he was a pariah on the European Council meetings. And that feeling of, oh, they don't love us in Brussels either, they're giving us a bad deal. I'm not sure if the tone that Junkers use. Do you think Europe could have done something more to get them to stay? Or does all the responsibility fall squarely on London?
Yeah.
No digo ni un 40, pero...
Not 60-40, but perhaps a different tone. I wonder if that might have helped him have that extra 5 or 10% that he needed.
Well, then Macron had made powerful speeches saying, in English, saying, guys, we love you.
Exactly.
You're part of this, you belong. And I remember the day that the UK left the European Parliament in 2019, the whole Parliament links arms and sings Auld Lang Syne, which is a Scottish song, kind of for old friends who are leaving. And people have tears in their eyes. It was beautiful, but we didn't have that in 2016. Yeah.
¿Más preguntas?
Any more questions?
Gets to ask you about the Netherlands, since you grew up there. How do you explain the victory of Geert Wilders, and what this can mean for the European politics, taking into account that there will be European elections in June, that this anti-migrant rhetoric is gaining ground now, even on the left side, with this new party in Germany? How is this going to have an impact, in fact, as how much it has changed the Netherlands since Pim Fortuyn till today?
Well, anti-migrant feelings in the Netherlands are not new. So last night, the Dutch elections, which many of you may have missed because Holland, very sadly, the biggest party is Geert Wilders' PVV, which is a far-right, very Islamophobic party. And they won 25% of the vote, which is not spectacular, but it was big enough to make them the biggest party. And I think he surprised us all, including me, partly by, in the last few days, saying, guys, I've become more moderate. I want to work in the Dutch system. I want to be in a coalition with the kind of center-right, and we can work together. I will drop my ban of the Quran, which was part of his policy for many years. And so he moved, like Le Pen has done, like Meloni has done, he moved kind of more towards the sensible center. And Wilders is not a lunatic. He's not Donald Trump. He understands the Dutch parliamentary system. He's been in parliament nearly 30 years. And he said, guys, I still offer you xenophobia and bigotry, but in a kind of more parliamentary, normal context. And so he normalized himself. What will the consequences be? I mean, does anybody else care what Holland does? Will it matter in the European elections? Will even the Dutch be more xenophobic than they were last time? I'm not sure. I think it will matter in the Dutch government's behavior in Europe, because you now have a government that is like Hungary in being anti-immigration, is like Hungary in being skeptical of Ukraine. So he does not want the Netherlands to support Ukraine. And so I think it will add to the kind of strength of the Orban-style leaders in Brussels, in the European Council.
Hay una cosa que tiene.
There's something that has to do with the Netherlands, which is how Europe, in a good way, has become an international nationalist association. There are several nationalist parties that coordinate, they're part of the same parliamentary group, but they're an international nationalist association. And it's really interesting to see the clashes that are coming up now. The Fratelli d'Italia, which is the ruling party in Italy, they were traditionally Eurosceptic, not so much now, but they were celebrating the Wilders victory in Holland. Wilders is against giving more money to the Italians or letting Italians have more fiscal deficit, and the Spaniards too. It's interesting that Vox, that says we have too much European Union, the European Union is taking away our sovereignty, they're now going to the European Parliament saying, fix the problems in Spain. I think it's interesting to see Europe turn into nationalists who can only solve their conflicts in the European Union. Any other questions?
Simon, I was thinking when you were talking about Theresa May and what happened with her time in the office, why was she not capable of selling the narrative of the different agreements between the European Union and the UK she was proposing?
I mean, it was partly both the Brexiteers and my group, the Remainers, were unrealistic. So the Brexiteers, Theresa May was offering a fairly moderate form of Brexit, where I think Britain would stay in the single market, or anyway, we would keep reasonably close links, I can't remember the exact details, with the EU, but Brexit. And for the Brexiteers, this was not enough. It had to be more radical. It had to be the complete Brexit. And then for Remainer politicians, it was too much Brexit. And we wanted to stop this, and people like me still hoped in 2019 that we could stop Brexit, which I now think would have been a democratic disaster. I think Brexit had to happen. Once you vote for it, you have to do it, because otherwise you create an undemocratic situation which is going to make people very angry. But so a lot of Remainer politicians would not vote for her Brexit because it was a Brexit. And now we got something much worse. We got a huge Brexit, what do they call it, a hard Brexit. So with hindsight, as Rory Stewart has said, the Remainers should have supported Theresa May's Brexit.
My question may sound a bit like science fiction, but I was wondering if you see there's any chance that, considering the catastrophic effects of Brexit, that the society wants in the future to go back to the European Union. Do you think there's any chances that there's a request, or that this is like out of the picture?
It's very likely at some point. So I think it will take at least 10 years or so. You need both parties to support re-entry, so that Brussels, because you can't go to Brussels and say, well, we, the Labour Party, want to return. Then Brussels says, yeah, but what if the Conservatives win the next election? Do you Brexit again? So you need a a durable long-term support of re-entry from both parties, knowing that re-entry is going to be very painful, might have to accept the euro, will go in worse than we left. And it will also recreate the whole horrible fight that the British had among themselves for many years. So I don't think it will happen soon. My colleague Gideon Rachman, interestingly, he says it could happen very fast. He said British politics is so febrile and so changeable right now. Already something like 60+% think that Brexit was a mistake, and nearly 60% want to rejoin now, which is insane. We can't rejoin now, but nearly 60% of the population wants this. And Gideon says when opinions change, it can go very quickly. He says return could become a new consensus fast. I don't think fast, but eventually.
Molt bé, ¿y alguna otra pregunta?
Any other questions? We still have a few minutes left. Okay. Regarding the Remain issue, one of the consequences of Brexit, which was widely spoken about, was that Scotland voted Remain. Scotland voted Remain in the EU, and that aggravated and generated a desire to vote for the independent referendum that Boris Johnson said no. What's your take on this part of the UK? That little rage in Scotland to go back, I don't know if they could drag the rest of Europe behind them. Or is that movement completely extinguished now? Especially after the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon.
Because
Well, I must
You are
ask you
going
about
to regret
Scotland,
it.
sorry. I think the Scottish situation is quite similar to Catalonia now, that you had this Rabia, this independence movement, and it's now kind of weakening a bit as it hits reality. Issues like it's very hard constitutionally for Scotland to leave, for Catalonia to leave. If you did somehow manage to leave, what is your relationship with Europe? So Scotland is not in Europe. If Scotland somehow leaves the UK, then it applies to enter the EU. What does Spain say?
Oh, they said they would welcome them.
I'm not convinced because then the Catalans say,
No, but there was a debate, right? And they said, it was quite funny. Fue muy interesante porque...
It was really interesting because in those debates in the European Parliament, when the singing and in Brussels, there was a will of like, Scots, we are willing to take you into the fold again. And they seem to have forgotten about that. There was in that movement that wasn't so much independentist, that it was as pro-Europe. There was that pragmatic independence to go back to the European Union. But we nearly don't talk about this anymore.
The independence parties for different reasons. But let's say Scotland rejoins the EU, somehow joins the EU. Then you have a border with England. Most Scottish trade, of course, is with England. Suddenly England is not in the EU, but you are. I mean, that's a disastrous situation. So I
Even
think
more complicated than that.
It's just very, very practically difficult. And they're not even allowed to have a referendum, just like the Catalans. So practically it's very, very difficult to see it happening. But also the Scots now think, Scotland is a more left-wing country than England. And the Scots hate the Conservatives. The kind of Conservative they hate most of all is an Eton Conservative like Boris Johnson. But now soon England is going to elect a left-wing government, the UK, with Labour. And then the Scots won't be so unhappy.
Okay, well, we'll see. Thank you very much. No sé si volem fer alguna altra.
I wonder if we have any other questions, and if not, we're going to leave it here. Thank you so much, Simon and Ramón.